Welcome to another episode of Ok Xoomer, Zoom interviews with creative engineers and more. I'm your host, Aaron Lichtig, Xometry guy and former Jeopardy champion. And today we are joined by two people on a single episode of Ok Xoomer for the first time. Joined by Jesse, Rosalia, and Ryan Vinyard. And they're here today because they collaborated on a project called the Hardware Document Toolkit, which they're going to show everyone in a few minutes. But first, let's meet both Jesse and Ryan. So Jesse is the co-founder and CEO of Bommer. And Bommer builds plugins that integrate with your CAD applications and automate some of the most tedious aspects of building, capturing, and exporting a project's bill of materials. He's got about 20 years experience in software development and architecture, including 2 years as a CTO of a robotics startup. So he's got a lot of mechanical engineering and hardware experience as well. So welcome, Jesse. And do you want to tell us a little bit about Bommer and why you decided to start that company?
Yeah, sure. So at the robotics company where I was CTO, we had a lot of challenges. It was a really complicated project, but one of the challenges that we had that just felt unnecessarily difficult was getting a good parts list to order out of our CAD tools. So when I left that gig and looked at what to do next, I looked at, well, I know that problem kind of well, and I've been a software developer for a while. Maybe there's something I can do to fix it. And what I've learned over the last few years is this is a problem that everyone loathes and detests and hates, and it's tedious work, and it's tedious work beyond just the parts list. If you want to get thumbnails out, if you want to get dimensions out of your CAD tool, if you want all of that good data into a form that you can actually use, most of the time people are manually transcribing that from CAD to Excel, and that's where errors can happen. So that's what we try and do, is we try and automate a lot of that so that errors can't happen and you save time that can now be used for better and more frequent design efforts.
Excellent. And we're going to talk a lot more about bills of materials today when we get into the Hardware Document Toolkit. But now let's meet our second guest, Ryan Vinyard. He runs Vinyard Product Development, and he's a consultant who supports hardware development through project management work, documentation, and process facilitation. And he was previously the vice president of manufacturing at Molecule and director of engineering at the Highway 1 Hardware Accelerator. And he's also written a book called The Hardware Startup. He's the co-author of that book. So welcome, Ryan. And to kick off, can you tell us a little more about some of your consulting work and also your book?
Yeah, thanks for the intro, Aaron, and thanks for having us on. Excited to talk about the toolkit, and excited to be here with Jesse, and excited to be the first dual interview. So much excitement. In Vineyard Product Development, what I really try to do is help people through those hard early stages of startup hardware growth and development, where there's so many unknowns, trying to figure out what they even need to do, what they need to resource, what the technical disciplines are that they're not used to managing, interfacing with, and having to grow. So like you said, my last full-time role being in VP manufacturing, I've shifted more to the development side of things, like I was at Highway 1, where we got to help lots of startups through that phase, help lots of startups through growth. That's where I originally met Jesse when he was working in robotics, and we've been friends ever since, and wanted to collaborate again. So it's good to work on this together. And the Hardware Startup, the book, was a great collaboration with a few investors at the time back in the Highway 1 days, trying to capture what is hardware now. It's interesting to look back at it 4 years later. I've looked back to see, how relevant is what we said about 3D printing 4 years ago? How relevant is, how fast does hardware change? And, the takeaway for me is one of the key quotes from the book was Bunny Huang saying, the hardware doesn't change, the equations do, right? Like how fast things do change, the coefficients of our equations change, but the fundamental things, we're still, moving plastics and metals and bits and atoms, right? So always been loving hardware and excited to keep helping people with hardware.
Excellent. Well, let's hop over to the Hardware Document Toolkit, pardon me. Now, this is a tool that Jesse and Ryan built together, and it's a tool that anyone can use. And when they put it on the screen, you'll be able to see the address and see where you can access it yourself. But the goal was to make bills of material more accessible to people who are documenting their hardware. So we can hop over to the document, but first, can you tell us more about why you decided to do this, why you decided to take this on?
Yeah, absolutely, Aaron. This is an idea I've been talking to a lot of people about for a while, trying to, quote unquote, open source or, get out to the community more documentation and definition around that documentation and hardware. There's more and more accessibility, especially in the software world, on all sorts of documentation and libraries and the community and sharing. And I feel there's a strong community in hardware. I co-organize the SF Hardware Meetup, and we see it there, but there's just not the open documentation that people need to get started. So it's something that resonated with people as I've been talking about it. It's something I've been figuring out. How do we make this most effective? There are templates out there. There are some examples. There are, good documents, bad documents of certain things. But when I looked at it, bill of materials really stood out as one of the key interface documents from, design tools into real manufacturing documentation. And there was nobody better to collaborate with it on than Bommer, because my whole idea was, let me really work with some depth experts in each of these tools and figure out how do we make a tool that helps lots of people. So once we started doing that, as you'll see and Jesse will show you through, it grew from, hey, let's make a template. Well, there are templates out there. Hey, let's make some examples and definitions around that. The glossary that we grew to really start to baseline the jargon amongst hardware professionals and rookies and hackers and makers and everyone, to get us even talking the same talk, we found to really be the value that we were building on. So we've got a lot of great feedback. We want to continue to get feedback and make the tool better. So I'll let Jesse tell you a little bit more about the tool itself from there.
Cool. Let me share my screen. Y'all can see it?
There we go.
Perfect. So as Ryan said, the goal of this project, and I don't think this can be overstated, perhaps is the right word, is we wanted to demystify documentation, specifically bill of materials documentation for people who are trying to put hardware together. We've both seen a lot of pitfalls that people fall into. We've also both seen a lot of interesting best practices emerge out of people who have taken those war wounds and learned from them. And so when we first set out to do this, the first thing we said, as Ryan said, was it's not going to be another template because there are templates out there. We want to go a little bit further and start adding some transparency to the process. Before I move on, bom.hwdocs.com is how you access it, bom.hwdocs.com. That takes you right to this sheet. And the getting started, or the how to use guide, kind of walks you through step by step how to use this tool, and then also how to contribute or collaborate with us to make it better if that's something you might want to do. And then also how to get in touch with us. So if I move on to the glossary, as Ryan said, this is the crown jewel in this tool, and it's because it's the one piece that really explains not just what a bill of materials is, but why you might want to build up a bill of materials this way. It's broken down into a couple of subcategories. So basic properties we think apply to all, mechanical engineering properties, electrical sourcing, and assembly, packaging, and kitting properties. And we put a description of each property and then why we think that property, or why we've observed that property, might matter for that type of bill of materials. An example of this that we always come back to, and we always joke that you could write a book on part numbering systems with how everyone has come up with their own system, and they have it's almost like a philosophy that people adopt in how they do it. We try to steer clear of that here, but we do make it very clear that a part number should identify a unique part across your organization, because if you have conflicts, then you might get the wrong thing, you might use the wrong part, and you might end up building the wrong product. And that's the level of detail and also the goal that we've strived for with this thing, is giving people that context to make sure that they don't make the same mistakes that, frankly, we've done. Beyond that, we tried to put a couple of examples together. The ME BOM, EE BOM, and assembly BOM tabs at the bottom of the screen, take those properties that we define in the glossary and lay them out into an example BOM. We use a microcontroller with an enclosure and some like various additional accessories as a example product. And then we also add in all of that that extra stuff that you might or might not remember to think about when you're actually going to manufacturing, like accounting for manufacturer value add or warranty reserve. It should be stated that these numbers are not real. Don't hold us to any, like your manufacturer value add may or may not be $10 on something like this, but it is an example of a cost that you have to account for when you're looking at your total cost of goods sold, which is of course the number that really matters if you want to make money in hardware. And similarly to the glossary, the way we anticipate people will use these tools is look at them as examples. You can maybe view them as some sort of a quasi template, but really understand why we put them in here and then model your own bill of materials after this for the purpose that that you want to achieve. One other thing that we learned sort of straight away is there are a lot of different types of bill of materials out there, a whole lot. We took 3 and made examples of them, but there are way more. We don't cover MBOMs. We don't cover manufacturing BOMs here, although that is coming in a future revision of the template. But I'm sure there's others. People have asked us about tracking tolerance, optical tolerance, mechanical tolerance, other sort of tolerance informations. That might belong in someone's bill of materials, but maybe not in another one if you're just trying to capture part numbers and costs. And that is sort of the sort of last little bit that I'll leave you with before sort of yielding the floor is this toolkit is a guide, and our goal is not that that people would consume the guide and be able to synthesize what works for them. So if you think that you need to capture this property in your bill of materials, which at the end of the day is a communications tool, then it probably belongs in there. If you think that it's unnecessary and it's constraining you in ways that you don't want, then it may not belong in there, and both are okay as long as you understand why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, well, thanks for walking through this. This is a really great tool, and I think especially now, trackability and traceability across a supply chain is extraordinarily important because you don't want to lose, not know where one part or one key piece of what you're working on is, because that could be the part where you have a supply chain issue related to COVID. So this, yep. And as you mentioned, everybody has their own way of doing this kind of thing, but I love what you guys have done here, made it very clear, have some good set templates that people can work from and customize for their own project or their own business.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And that was the vision, was for people to build on it. And like you're saying, it resonates with people more now than ever that hardware is about communication, right? It's difficult for us not all being able to be in the same shop and see the same things at the same time, but it makes documentation and clearly communicating on that, having the same set of expectations, knowing what we're all saying by the same terminology, so much more crucial than it did even a few months ago. So we've seen that resonating with people. And like Jesse said, we've gotten lots of good feedback on the tool, and we want to keep getting feedback and specific use cases for how people use their BOMs and want to see added to this.
Excellent. So if anyone wants to use this or to contribute to it, you pull up the website there. It's bom.hwdocs.com. You can check that out. Ryan and Jesse, thank you for joining us today. This has been another episode of OK Zoomer. We'll be back in a few days with one more. Thanks, everyone.